holding the actual arena, and the outskirts gate. There would be two entrances into the office, the massive hallway in front of you and another hallway behind you, which you can't see but is conveyed on the map. The way you would defend yourself would have to do with some sort of decoy that you would have to put up on either side of the office. I'm assuming that would also have to do with the two cameras on either side of the office. Speaking of which, they have an interesting mechanic. Only one camera can be used at a time, and the way they're activated is by clicking and holding to charge them. These are the only two cameras that can be seen directly outside the office, so it's a high risk, high reward for being able to use them properly. As for threats, the game would feature the Bygone animatronics. The group would include Buster and Ned, but also someone new that goes by the name of Circupup, who would activate on Night 5. It's implied that Circupup was made by a different company from the ones who made Buster and Ned. That company would eventually go bankrupt, and all properties were given to Buster's. The whole deal with the Bygone animatronics is that they've been abandoned for years, so it makes sense why they're all grouped together like this. The word Bygone actually refers to an earlier time. There was supposed to be one more character added, named Morphin. If this version was ever completed, he was supposed to be the only character active on Night 7. I think it's safe to assume that Morphin would have been a hybrid of all the Bygone animatronics, in the form of some hallucination. He greatly resembles aspects of each of the characters: the head of Buster, ears of Ned, and limbs of Circupup. As much as hybrid characters have been done to death in recent memory, it's really cool to see how the style would have been interpreted in 2018. And as far as I can remember, this is one of the earliest examples of this. The name Morphin could have also referred to how the characters have morphed into one being, but my interpretation is that the name is actually referring to morphine, because no amount of it could have suppressed the absolute pain that this guy would have inflicted. I mean, his character description is just 3 question marks. When have question marks ever represented anything good at the end? Anyway, this build was super interesting. It reminds me more of the style that Five Nights at Wario's had, with those super grungy environments, mixed with what, assuming were to be placeholders, look to be low-poly characters and designs. However, the second build of Project Readjusted 2 is where things get a little bit more interesting. There's an actual character coded. There's a version of Ned that will occasionally wander into the office, where you have to be completely still if you want him to leave. While he is coded, it's inherently clear that there's still more work to do, as my game would crash randomly even if I was completely still the entire time I was in the office. I'm assuming this version of Ned is also Bygone Ned, as he looks almost identical to the one from the first build. This time, the location is in an actual restaurant, the size of which looks to have been scaled down dramatically to accommodate the fewer animatronics, only featuring a few party rooms, a main area, and a backstage. I mean, it's definitely cool, don't get me wrong, but I think paired with the mechanics, it's easy to see why this game was canned. In the cameras, there are buttons to toggle the camera light, which would also allow you to use the light in the office. I'm only assuming that's what it would have been, but there's no clear indication. It seems as if Mechless also didn't have a clear vision for this mechanic, which isn't great because it's referred to as one of the main mechanics in the synopsis in the extras menu. There's also one more mechanic in the form of a camera connection status, which will slowly deplete. I'm guessing this mechanic works almost the exact same as something like the air duct controls in the first build. Overall, a weird direction for the series, but if there's one thing Mechless learned from this build, it's that he wanted Project Readjusted 2 to be dark. For sure visually, but somewhat thematically. Content 3 is a smaller build, but easily the most interesting so far. This version of Project Readjusted 2 would have taken place in a warehouse of sorts and would feature a threat that really isn't an animatronic. The player would be sanctioned in the back of the warehouse, monitoring the outside of the building for possible intruders. If one is spotted, the player is instructed to call 911 to have them dealt with. I don't know who or what could be outside trying to get into a warehouse, but someone clearly important to the story. This concept is interesting by itself, and it's even more interesting to see how in retrospect this would have been sort of retconned in Project Readjusted 3. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth soon. Something else that I found out a little later is that the only actual threat in this version of PR2 would have been Cable Buster, who finally makes his first appearance. There would actually be multiple Busters that you could lure around. Not jumping to any conclusions or assumptions, but it would have been really cool if you could sick Buster on one of the intruders if the phone line went dead or something. The fourth variant of Project Readjusted 2 is surprisingly more complete than the last 3, which is interesting because according to the extras menu in the final PR2, it's regarded as the first build, being traced back to as early as 2017. Only the menu and some of the basic office functions were ever finished, but even so, there's still a lot to cover, especially on this menu. I love how Buster looks at whatever button the player has their mouse over. While the menu is mostly finished, the only button that actually works is the button to start a new game. Immediately after loading into the office, it's obvious that even super early into development, Mechless wanted the game to be as dim as possible, and I don't think anything demonstrates that better than its office. It's so dark, and you feel the impact right away. This version of Project Readjusted 2 takes place in an abandoned daycare. Wait, where have I seen this one before? Jokes aside, this environment is incredible, even if it is a little hard to believe that this is actually an abandoned daycare and not just some underground research facility. And to think that this was modeled and constructed in 2017, a time where very few games could replicate an environment that detailed, is unbelievable. I mean, you have everything from the wires to the ambient lighting, and to think that this never saw the light of day is a little odd. I think this would have been extremely popular given the time period. Even compared to the office in the final version of PR2, it feels like a considerable upgrade in ambience. That's of course not to say that the version we have is bad, but it surely feels underwhelming compared to this. While we're in the office, we can look left to what is presumably a hallway, and how one could ever argue that this is one point a daycare is beyond me. I mean, this is more resemblant to Outlast. You can also turn to the right wall in the office, and by clicking you can enter a safe room. This concept is really cool, and I've only seen it done ever in Five Nights at Wario's 2. Nothing can be done in the room, so I would assume the mechanic that's tied to it would have been something to do with waiting out a character. Going back to the main area, there's two panels. One that hasn't been coded, which I would only assume to be a camera system. The other panel is surprisingly functional. It's called the config mainframe, and is used to control all the moving parts. The main component is the temperature manager, where you can change the building's temperature to pretty much anything. There's a warning below it that says if the temperature is below 65 degrees or above 85 degrees, an emergency alarm will trigger. I'm assuming that there would have been a character that would require the temperature to be either extremely high or low, and the only way to get rid of them would have to trigger an alarm, potentially triggering someone else. It's for sure a unique idea, even if I don't have the best idea of how it would be implemented. At the bottom is a space to purchase upgrades to your equipment, such as better Wi-Fi and a faster cooldown. All of the upgrades cost money, so I'm assuming that there would have been a currency system similar to the final version. Overall, the fourth file is super interesting to see. I don't think that a game like Project Readjusted would have gone in a direction like this, especially considering how the first game ended. The fifth file is another surprisingly competent early build. This time, red is the primary color used, and it's paired nicely with a new character on the menu. I'm unsure as to who this is, but from what I can gather, it seems to be another early version of Cable Buster, or this new character called Scrapster, which seems to be Project Readjusted's Springtrap equivalent before Infested Glancer. From the extras menu in PR2, it's revealed that even though this version of the game was short-lived, there was a working AI. Exactly who it was is unknown, because from my playthrough and looking at others online, no one can get it to activate. However, we do know how two of the characters would work. Buster would wander around like normal and eventually end up at the door on the right side of the office. We then have to pull a lever that activates this decoy, which is essentially an animatronic on a stick that's used as a door. Magic Suit would also be a part of this build, and they would behave similar to Buster, except we'd have to use a jammer to stop them when we see them in the cameras. The jammer itself is hooked up to this panel on the far right of the office. It allows us to jam any camera that we input, which would seemingly deal with Magic Suit as well as potentially freeze anyone else that was in the same room. At the bottom, there's a section to enter a staff exit key. I'm assuming this would have been the objective of each night, having to either complete a certain task and only being allowed to clock out once it's been completed and we obtain the staff key. I actually like this idea a lot. As you'll come to see when we talk about PR3 and its task-based system, the night ends almost immediately after you finish the task, but adding a whole other thing to do on top of that would have created some pretty intense situations. The final build is the most akin to the original Project Readjusted. We are back at another Buster's location, one that I would assume is very close in design and structure. The office is a bit bigger than the original, but it feels more run down and thrown together, almost as if it was an abandoned room that was quickly constructed to make an office, similar to the original. The parallels between the two are very noticeable here, much more than ever, which I really have come to appreciate. Over on the left side, there's a camera panel that shows a general layout of the building. It's definitely bigger than before, the shape reminding me of a large circuit with branching paths every so often. From the extras menu description, it's revealed that the gameplay in this version was slower paced, which was the main reason for its eventual cancellation. We also get a small glimpse of some of the mechanics: a pulse level, a light projection setting, security light fixtures that could be activated, and finally a denoise function. The latter to all of those being the only one coded into the build. It works almost identical to the light switch in Flumpty's 2, where once pressed, the lights go out, but so does all of your systems. It's revealed in the synopsis that this would give some time for a character to leave. What is never mentioned anywhere is who would actually have starred in this version. My guess is a new version of the Project Readjusted cast, alongside some old Wither characters, building off this FNAF 2 feel. That's really it for this build, and the box as a whole for that matter. This was by far my favorite addition onto a Project Readjusted game. I don't think I needed to cover this, but I'm glad I did, because seeing where the series was headed at certain points in time was really cool. And besides, a lot of these characters return in an old build of Project Readjusted 3. Speaking of, in late August of 2020, Five Nights at Freddy's creator Scott Cawthon would take to Reddit to announce what he called the Fazbear Fanverse Initiative, a program that he was starting to directly fund and license fan games as official FNAF products. This was a huge deal for the community. Along with this announcement, Scott Cawthon would confirm 5 new games to be developed by some of the community's largest figures. Mechlis heard about the news and decided to announce a new project of his own, Project Readjusted 3. Being a year and a half since the release of Project Readjusted 2, Mechlis had allegedly hated the development process, lamenting how it was the bane of his existence. Which is fair enough, honestly. If I were to make 14 variants of what was narratively the same game, I would go insane too. But now with his new motivation and painful learning experience behind him, he was ready to start anew. The version of Project Readjusted 3 that Mechlis would begin work on was much different from the final version. The only reason I'm going to go into this much detail about another scrapped version is because this was closer to completion than any of the scrapped PR2 builds. When Mechlis started work on PR3 sometime around August 2020, this version of the game was not only thematically different, but most likely was a complete departure from the story that he had built up. While this can't be confirmed at the moment, from what was shown, it's hard to connect the former games to this. The Elevator version of Project Readjusted 3, at least from what we can see from the promotional material online and the working file that we'd later get, was supposed to take large inspiration from UCN. While that most likely wasn't the full intention, because a full main campaign was planned, it's what we see from the latest build, so it's presumably what the game became after a while. The Elevator version features almost every single character from every version of Project Readjusted. This not only includes almost every character from the scrap PR2 builds, but also a ton of new characters. The 2 main characters that I want to direct your attention to, Subject and Subjected Buster, were supposed to carry this game's story, but since this version's cancellation, they fell out of relevancy. There's also a couple of characters from other games Mechlis was working on, most notably Honeybear from Honeybear's Fantasy and the Baby Geist from Baby's Nightmare Circus. I'm really not sure how they would have fit into the game's story, but I'm sure they were probably custom night exclusives. From the build we got, the game would have been very customizable. The main objective is never shown, but the main premise is that we're sanctioned in an elevator. Presumably, it would go further down in the building during the night and introduce new characters, but that's all up to speculation. Depending on who you added into the night, they'd make your way towards you through a map that you would create yourself, choosing where the different rooms are, which hallways connect, and where each character starts. The idea itself is extremely promising, and from what I've played, that's very apparent. Each character has their own stats and specs that make them all different. To accompany this is a difficulty meter on the side of the main screen, allowing you to control how difficult you want the night to be. Everything in this build showcases how well something similar to this would have been. That's not to say that this in itself is perfect, far from it. As development on the Elevator version continued, Mechlis would begin to experience a reoccurring problem. He would get too many ideas, and when trying to implement them, he'd experience some issue with functionality. This would cause Mechlis to completely scrap the Elevator version of Project Readjusted 3 in favor of the Glowstick version, which he'd actually started before committing to the Elevator version. It's a shame to see all this hard work being scrapped, especially since a good portion of renders were complete. I wonder if someone will take what Mechlis started and finish it, considering that almost all of the materials are available, but who knows. Regardless, this is probably one of my favorite pieces of Project Readjusted history. Before we move on, there was one more project that Mechlis was working on behind the scenes before finishing Project Readjusted 3. Growing tired of massive fan games that take too long and are too ambitious, Mechlis set his sights on something much smaller in scope, but could still hook his audience. The Project Readjusted remake is a remake of a remake, and a complete overhaul at that too. While we don't have nearly as much information on this game as we do some of the other scrap projects from this time, we have a post, multiple screenshots, and a couple of videos. The remake was probably started because, well, Project Readjusted kinda sucks. Like, no offense, and I still stand by everything I said in that portion of the video, but compared to Project Readjusted 3, it's not very good. This remake would have also allowed for the story to be refined to fit with the new entry. So, with a couple of reasons for this to exist, let's take a look at what would have been changed. First and foremost, the game is much more appealing visually. It doesn't hurt to look at anymore, which is always nice. The building also looks to have been overhauled, not looking stale and unlived in, but rather a pretty convincing rendition of a restaurant with the same style from that time frame. From the video we get of the office gameplay, the building layout was also massively cut down. This is a change I'm all for, since the original Project Readjusted had way too many rooms and didn't use very many of them. But now with only 5 rooms, not including the office, there's practically a use for each of them. It's not like the reduction in cameras is at all a compromise either. Like I touched on earlier, it feels more realistic that way. I mean, think about it. In a real restaurant akin to those of Chuck E. Cheese's, there's one large open area with a couple of extra rooms surrounding those for storage, kitchen, repairs, whatever. This new layout resembles that greatly. Let's talk about characters for a quick moment. There's still only 6 characters, but without Vinard. Thank God. Glancy has been separated to become new versions of both Glancer and Glossy. This is an extremely welcome change. I personally despised Vinard from the start. He almost has like no lore relevance and was just too different from the other characters to make any logical sense. Like, why was he there? Vinard has absolutely zero reason to exist except for the fact that he has a chip. Which makes me wonder, who would have gotten it instead? My bet is on Redeemer, but I wouldn't be too surprised if it also went to Ned, since his new model is a million times better and I would love for him to have more importance. Sadly, just like most projects so far, Meklis' expectations far exceeded what he was willing to put in, and promptly cancelled the game. However, there have been talks of other developers reviving the remake, so maybe sometime soon this version will see the light of day. Since my original video in April 2022, a lot has changed. A major content update has been released, including a new max mode, a new ending, a literal online multiplayer game, and many more improvements. For my playthrough, I played through the most recent patch, version 3.5.7. Although I don't think this game will receive any more content past this patch, that's also what I felt 2 years ago, and yet here we are. I wanted to re-review the game a few months after my first video in August, to coincide with the release of 3.0. I eventually scrapped that idea since it felt like I was regurgitating the same points I made in my original video. Now, with the background knowledge of the previous 3 games, the scrapped remake and main series entries, I think I'm ready to take the full walk into Project Readjusted 3. However, we need to do this a little differently. Project Readjusted 3 was more or less the series' curtain call. This game has 3 versions, each fundamentally similar but with minor changes. You have version 1, which was more or less the bare-bones version of PR3, all the essential components and story, but lacking much polish. Then, a year later, you have version 2, the version I played when I made my video. And then finally, you have version 3, which was released last August and serves as a way to conclude this series as we know it, removing any potential teaser material that would have been briefly used for future projects. For every game in this video, I've played on the newest patch and briefly mentioned earlier patches, such as how I described PR1's legacy build. For this section specifically, I will be referring to PR3's version 2 build on its latest patch, version 2.1.2. This is entirely because this build was the definitive version of Project Readjusted 3 for a while, and so much of what comes next for this series is directly tied to this version. I want to talk about version 3 in greater detail later on, since there are a couple of differences. I hope that's not too confusing. Where we left off, Meklis switched back to the glowstick version of Project Readjusted 3, which was less complex and more rooted in its origin than the elevator version. Development went smoother than before, and the game was finished within 3 months after returning to glowstick. Not much was said between the Switch and the release window announcement. While we don't know what the broader Project Readjusted fanbase was thinking or expecting, we know that not as much hype was present when the game was released on the 5th of November 2021. This was the basis of my original video. This game was incredible and no one was talking about it. I remember dying on night 2 and going to YouTube to look up a tutorial when I found that no one had made a single video on it. I played it in February, 4 months after the game was released, and still nothing. So that's why this game, at least in my heart, is forever underrated. Okay, enough about the introduction, I want to talk about the game already. Upon opening the game, you'll load into the main menu. In the background, a more rundown looking area can be seen with a rabbit head scribbled on the wall. Its third eye opened, and the word "us" is written multiple times around it, almost as if the rabbit head is a symbol of knowledge that can only be obtained if you're one of them. On the wall in the back, some masks can be seen hanging. These masks look exactly like the rabbit head drawn on the wall. You're immediately hit with this incredible score composed by Efefsky. I mentioned this in my original PR3 video, but I firmly believe that the soundtrack in this game is the best fan game soundtrack and what makes the game as ambient and dystopian as it is. This entire menu screen is incredible. It perfectly sets up the feeling of the game. The game opens on a cutscene with a mysterious voice calling us out by name, claiming they know who we are and where our intentions lie. The eerie voice tells us that they can provide us with the information that we want on Matthew, still missing, and Andrew, the protagonist, who's still searching for anything that could lead him to a definitive conclusion. The voice provides us with an ultimatum. His image similarly appears on the screen to the cutscenes in the previous games, but this time more scratches are on the side of the image. While this could be a stylistic choice, I believe it represents Andrew's desperation to finish the story, or at least to forget what happened and move on. The images seem to be drawings based on Andrew's memories of his experiences in between game sections. It feels as if he's using these depictions to tie everything he knows together, only as he continues, he begins to lose sight of what he's really after and becomes too focused on just the important details. It's also more than possible that the scratches could be prefacing what's to come later in the game, almost like he's trying to forget what happened. I could again just be looking way too deeply into this, but honestly, doing so is my favorite part of this franchise because it actually allows you to do this. You may have also noticed that the voice, or more so person, is wearing a rabbit mask to conceal their identity. The mask is similar to the drawing depicted on the menu, although right now it's unclear what purpose the mask serves. The voice's ultimatum is simple: keep 3 people he's holding captive alive for 5 days. These people are full of knowledge on Matthew and have agreed to tell us as long as we play along with his game, where whoever remains alive will be released. It's also important to mention that the voice switches from referring to himself to referring to himself as an us, implying that there's more people just like him that he's working with. Right now, these people aren't identified, but I think that the notion that there are more people involved in this admittedly sick game is beyond horrifying. The first night begins and we seem to be in a rundown repair shop, its age showing, as droplets of water hit the floor and echo throughout. A dense fog of darkness surrounds the player, only giving light to anything within a couple of feet. After a couple of seconds, the intercom buzzes and we finally hear the voice. He explains the basics to survival in the game, as well as how to use the tools around us. We're told that the 3 captives are held in separate rooms upstairs above us. They will survive as long as we listen to their exact instructions. The voice instructs us to open the tablet in front of us. There are 2 sections to the tablet, the security and supply modules. The voice tells us that the most important thing to focus on is the supply module. The 3 patients upstairs are locked in their rooms without food and water, and it is our job to supply them. We can send supplies to the 3 patients. Each of the 3 white squares represent a room in which supplies can be sent to. These squares can also be clicked on to change which room is getting supplies, further indicating by the arrow in the middle room. The voice reinforces that each of the white squares is also a form of life that we must do everything in our power to protect. Some odd wording for sure, considering all we're doing right now is just giving them food, but I digress. The voice then finishes by explaining the rest of the supply module. Opening the gate will send 1 box of supplies to whichever room the arrow in the middle is pointing towards. Only 1 box of supplies can be sent at a time, which also means that you can only help 1 person until they receive their supply, and then a new box can be sent out. The boxes that are sent out can either be yellow, indicating food, or blue, indicating water. There's no real pattern to what type of supply is being sent out. Some players have opted to send as many supplies as a given patient until they're entirely fed. This strategy is for the most part pretty hands-off, but it requires more materials since a patient could get more of one material than the other. The other strategy I've seen is meticulously divvying out the supplies to whoever needs them. This is much more involved, but it's more material conservative, which is what I opted to do because I found that getting more material was a much more involved process than switching to who gets material every so often. Speaking of,